The ghost at the altar, she uninvited me from my own son's wedding, so I brought someone she never expected to see again. Morning of my son's wedding, I ironed my dress carefully, the navy blue silk whispering against my fingers like a secret. I had chosen this dress 3 months ago, the same week Marcus called to tell me he was marrying Celeste Harrington. I had been happy for him. Genuinely, deeply happy. I had no idea that happiness would be weaponized against me. My name is Lick Forza. I spent 22 years in the United States Navy as a JAG officer, a military attorney who handled cases that kept admirals awake at night. I have cross-examined war criminals. I have defended innocent soldiers whose careers were being buried by corrupt commanding officers. I have sat across interrogation tables from men twice my size and held my ground without blinking. Nothing in those 22 years prepared me for what my son's fiancée was about to do. The call came the night before the wedding. It was 9:47 p.m. I remember because I had just finished packing my overnight bag and was reviewing the toast I planned to give at the reception. I had written it by hand on cream-colored stationery, the same kind my mother used when she wrote letters. Sentimental, maybe, but I wanted Marcus to have something real. My phone buzzed. Celeste's name lit up the screen. I answered on the second ring, expecting last-minute logistics. Perhaps she needed me to arrive earlier. Perhaps there was a seating arrangement she wanted to discuss. Her voice was flat, controlled, the kind of controlled that people practice. Celeste, hello, everything, need you to not come tomorrow. Silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever heard in my life. I'm sorry. The wedding, I need you to stay home. She paused, and when she continued, her tone carried something thin and sharp, like a wire pulled too tight. Marcus agrees. We've talked about it. Your presence would create unnecessary tension. I sat down on the edge of my bed, slowly, the way you sit when your legs have stopped taking instructions from your brain. Unnecessary tension, I repeated. You know what I mean, Lay, but I didn't, not fully, not yet. What I did know was this. I had written a check for $87,000 to cover their wedding venue, the catering, the flowers, the photography, and the string quartet that Celeste had specifically requested after seeing them perform at a charity gala in Charleston. I had done this without hesitation, without conditions, without ever once suggesting that my financial contribution entitled me to anything other than a seat in the front row to watch my son marry the woman he loved. I had also co-signed the lease on the apartment where they currently lived. I had flown to New York twice in the past year to help Celeste's mother plan the rehearsal dinner. I had sent a handwritten note to every member of the Harrington family welcoming them into ours. Celeste, I said, keeping my voice even, I believe there may be a misunderstanding. I've been involved in planning this event for over a year. This is not up for discussion. The wire in her voice pulled tighter. If you show up tomorrow, I will have you removed. In front of everyone, I will not allow you to ruin the most important day of my life. Line went dead. I sat in the silence of my bedroom for a long time. My toast sat on the nightstand, 3 handwritten pages, the ink still dark and intentional. I read the first line. Marcus, the day you were born, I understood for the first time what it meant to be responsible for something more important than yourself. I folded it carefully and placed it in the drawer. Then I picked up my phone and made a different call. Colonel Sandra Wentworth answered on the first ring. We had served together for 11 years before she moved into federal law enforcement. She was the kind of woman who treated phone calls at 10 p.m. as perfectly ordinary. She probably had 3 cases open on her laptop right now. Long time. Sandra. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me regardless of what the answer is. Always, Celeste Harrington, my son Marcus's fiancée, maiden name Celeste Ann Whitmore before she legally changed it 4 years ago. I paused. Do you know that name? The silence on Sandra's end lasted exactly 4 seconds. That was enough. She said carefully, why are you asking me about her? Because she just uninvited me from my son's wedding. The wedding I paid for. And something in her voice sounded like fear, not arrogance. Fear of something specific. And in my experience, when someone is that controlled about removing a person, it's because that person's presence creates a risk they're trying to manage. Another pause. Where are you right now? Home. Stay there, I'm going to make some calls. Give me 40 minutes. Sandra called back in 32. What she told me in the next 18 minutes changed everything. Celeste Ann Whitmore had grown up in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, the youngest daughter of a man named Gerald Whitmore, who had spent 15 years running a financial fraud operation through a network of shell companies disguised as veterans' charities. The operation had stolen approximately $14 million from military families across 7 states. Donations intended to support wounded soldiers, widows, children of the fallen. gone. Filtered through Gerald Whitmore's accounts and spent on real estate, private travel, and a lifestyle built entirely on the suffering of people who had already given everything, Gerald Whitmore had been investigated by the Naval Criminal Investigative Service in coordination with the FBI. He had been prosecuted. He had been convicted. The lead investigator on that case had spent 3 years building it from the ground up, tracking every transaction, securing every witness, dismantling every layer of protection Gerald's lawyers had constructed. That investigator's name was Captain Diane Mercer, United States Navy, retired. I had introduced Diane Mercer to Sandra Wentworth at a JAG conference in Washington 14 years ago. They had worked together twice since. And when Celeste Harrington showed up in Sandra's database 4 years after her father's conviction, Sandra had filed it away under the category of people worth watching. Celeste had changed her name, moved from Louisiana to Virginia, and by all appearances had built a new life, which on its own was not a crime. People left difficult pasts behind. People rebuilt. Sandra wasn't watching her because she had done anything wrong. Sandra was watching her because the one witness who had gone missing during her father's trial, a bookkeeper named Thomas Greer who had agreed to testify and then vanished 3 weeks before the verdict, had recently resurfaced. And Thomas Greer was talking. She knew, Sandra said. Greer is saying that Celeste, who was 19 at the time, was running documents between her father's office and the shell company accounts. She wasn't a passive beneficiary. She was a participant. I closed my eyes. Marcus know any of this? I don't know what Marcus knows, Lick. That's not something I can answer. I thought about my son. I thought about the man I had raised, the boy who at age 7 had cried for an hour when he accidentally stepped on a beetle, the teenager who had driven 40 minutes to return a cashier's incorrect change of $12 because he couldn't sleep knowing he had it, the adult who had built a career in non-profit work because he believed, genuinely believed, that the point of having resources was to protect people who didn't. Marcus didn't know. I was certain of it the way you are certain of things that live in your bones, which meant Celeste wasn't afraid of me because I knew her secret. She was afraid of me because I might find it. She was afraid of the 22 years of legal instinct sitting in the front row, watching her, reading her, afraid that I might notice something, ask the wrong question at the right moment, pull one thread from a sweater she had spent 4 years carefully constructing. She wasn't removing me to protect her wedding day, she was removing me to protect her life. I set the phone down and sat very still in the quiet of my home. My dress hung on the back of my closet door, navy blue silk. 3 months chosen, then I picked the phone back up and called Captain Diane Mercer. Diane arrived at my house at 7 a.m. in civilian clothes, a grey blazer and dark trousers, her silver hair cut close and precise. She was 61 years old and carried herself like someone who had never once confused politeness with weakness. We sat at my kitchen table, and I laid out everything Sandra had told me. Diane listened without interrupting, her hands wrapped around a coffee mug, her eyes tracking every word with the focused attention of someone who had spent decades making sense of complicated things. When I finished, she looked at me for a long moment. "What are you planning to do?" she asked. "I'm going to the wedding." "Lick, I'm going to the wedding," I said again quietly, not to cause a scene, not to expose her, not to intervene in whatever investigation is building. "I'm going because Marcus is my son and he deserves to have someone in that room who loves him enough to be there when things fall apart." I paused. "And things are going to fall apart, Diane. If not today, then soon. And when they do, I need him to know I was never the enemy." Diane studied me. "And you want me there?" "I want you there as my guest, as an old friend of mine." I met her eyes. "And if Celeste sees you and recognizes you, whatever happens in that moment is between her conscience and her choices, not mine." Diane was quiet for a long time. Then she set down her coffee mug and said, "What time does it start?" The wedding was held at a restored plantation estate outside of Richmond, Virginia, white columns and magnolia trees, and a lawn that looked like it had been individually trimmed with scissors. The guests were dressed in summer finery, champagne and laughter drifting across the gardens in the warm afternoon air. I walked in wearing the navy blue dress. No one stopped me at the door. The coordinator at the entrance had a list, and my name was on it because Celeste had called me too late the night before to have it removed. A small oversight born of arrogance. She had assumed I would comply. I found my seat in the 3rd row because the front row was reserved for immediate family, which as of the previous evening I apparently was not. I sat down, folded my hands in my lap and waited. Diane sat beside me. The ceremony was beautiful. I will not take that from anyone. The flowers were extraordinary, white peonies and trailing green. the kind of arrangements that cost more than most people's monthly rent. The string quartet played something by Vivaldi that hung in the warm air like a held breath. And Marcus, my son, stood at the altar in a charcoal suit with his father's watch on his wrist, and looked like everything I had ever hoped he would become. I kept my eyes on him the entire time. When the doors opened and Celeste appeared on her stepfather's arm, there was the collective intake of breath that always accompanies a bride's entrance. She was stunning in ivory silk, her dark hair swept back, her posture perfect. She walked as though she had rehearsed this moment 10,000 times. Halfway down the aisle, her eyes swept the room the way they always do, brides cataloguing their kingdom, and her gaze landed on me. The stumble was almost imperceptible. A single misstep, caught immediately, recovered with impressive precision. Her face didn't break, but for one fraction of a second her composure cracked like ice in spring. She had not expected me. She composed herself before she reached the altar. She was good, I had to acknowledge it. The ceremony proceeded. Vows were exchanged, rings were placed. Marcus kissed his bride to generous applause and the room exhaled. It was during the cocktail hour in the garden when it happened. Celeste moved through the guests with the practiced grace of someone who had spent years performing normalcy. She accepted congratulations. She laughed at the right moments. She touched Marcus's arm with the ease of a woman who understood the theatre of happiness. And then she turned and saw Diane Mercer standing 6 feet away from her, holding a glass of water, looking at her with the steady, uncomplicated gaze of a woman who had spent 3 years building a federal case against her family. The color left Celeste's face so completely and so suddenly that the woman beside her reached out a hand and said, "Honey, are you all right?" She was not all right. She pressed her fingers to her lips. Her glass tilted. A guest caught it. And then Celeste Harrington, née Whitmore, bride of my son Marcus Forza, sat down very suddenly on a nearby chair with the look of someone whose carefully constructed world had just developed a fault line directly beneath her feet. I moved toward my son. "Marcus," I touched his arm gently. He turned, and when he saw me, something moved across his face, complicated and raw. "I need you to find somewhere quiet with me, right now, before the dinner. There are things I need to tell you, and you deserve to hear them from me." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he looked at his wife, who was being attended to by concerned guests, her composure fracturing at the edges in ways only someone trained to read people could see. "Mom," he said, and his voice was very young and very old at the same time, "what's happening?" I took his hand. "I'm going to tell you everything," I said. "And then you're going to decide what to do with it. That's your right, and I will support whatever you choose. But I need you to know the truth because you have always deserved the truth. And because the people who love you most are the ones who tell it to you even when it costs them." He squeezed my hand. We walked away from the party together, my son and I, through the magnolia trees and the golden afternoon light, while behind us the music played and the guests laughed, and a woman who had built a life on the architecture of other people's secrets began, very quietly, to come undone. I had not come to destroy his wedding. I had come because a mother's job is not to protect her child from difficulty. A mother's job is to make sure that when the storm hits, her child knows he is not standing in it alone. The investigation into Celeste Whitmore Forza was reopened 6 weeks after the wedding, following Thomas Greer's formal deposition. Marcus hired his own attorney. He asked me to recommend someone, and I gave him 3 names, all former colleagues, all people of complete integrity. He and Celeste separated by mutual agreement that fall. The last conversation I had with Marcus about all of it was on a Tuesday evening in November. He called me from the apartment he had moved back into, the one downtown, and we talked for 2 hours about everything and nothing. About his father's watch, which he was still wearing. About the non-profit project he was planning for the following year. About the Thanksgiving menu. At the end of the call, before he hung up, he said, "Mom, I'm glad you came." "I know," I said. "I'm glad you brought her." "I know that too." A long pause, then quietly, "I'm glad you didn't give up on me." I thought of the toast I had written on cream-colored stationery. I thought of the first line, "Marcus, the day you were born, I understood for the first time what it meant to be responsible for something more important than yourself." "Marcus," I said, "giving up on you was never an option I had access to." He laughed, a real laugh, warm and unguarded, the laugh of the boy who cried over Beatles and drove 40 minutes to return $12. "My son, still there. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to remember that real love shows up, even when it isn't welcome, even when it costs something, even when the outcome is uncertain. The people who love you hardest are the ones who stay honest when honesty is the most expensive gift they have." A read in the comments if you believe a mother's love never uninvites itself. Subscriber for more stories about the quiet, unbreakable strength of the people who refuse to leave.